Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Richard Ferrer. He is a British journalist and editor of the UK's Jewish News. After working for the website totallyjewish.com from 2000 to 2004, he edited the Boston Jewish Advocate, the United States' oldest Jewish newspaper, before returning to the UK. Enjoy my conversation with Richard Ferrer. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's a pleasure to meet you and to speak with you. Before we get into what you're up to today, why don't you tell us where you're from, how you got started, everything that led up to what you're doing today?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for having me on. It's a real treat to be here. I've been doing journalism since 1995, long before the internet even, working on magazines that ruled the world back in the 90s, but are now sort of back in the great magazine graveyard in the sky. Titles like Vox, Maxim, FHM, lifestyle magazines such as that. So I was writing for them. Then I went into market researching for new magazines. There was one particular magazine I was very interested in, which was a teenage boy's lifestyle title. Back in the day, I don't know if it's the same in Israel or in the States, there was so many teenage girls magazines like More and Ms and Sugar and Bliss. There were no teenage boys magazines in the late 90s. If you didn't read about football, you had no magazine if you're a 14-year-old kid. So I market researched and launched a teenage boys lifestyle title. Then the internet came along, and that changed absolutely everything and has done ever since. It transformed publishing, transform the immediacy of the medium, the expectation of the reader, the expectation of the advertiser, everything completely transformed overnight. So I joined a company called totallyjewish.com, which was the big Jewish website for the Jewish community here in the UK. For about 2.5 minutes, I think I was a paper millionaire with share options. You know what it was like back in the day, with the big dot-com boom and bust. So I was at Totally Jewish for about 4 years. Then I went back to old media. I moved across to the United States, to Boston, and I edited the Boston Jewish Advocate, a very old, storied newspaper founded by Theodore Herzl back in the day. Sadly, that recently went out of business due to the pandemic and the internet, unfortunately. So a great historic title has unfortunately bit the dust. I don't think my tenure as editor had much to do with it, seeing as that was about 15 years ago. Then I came back to the UK and I worked for the Daily Mail here in London, and then a very short-lived title for Rupert Murdoch called the London Paper. Unfortunately, that closed after a year. And then back in 2009, so what's that now, 13 odd years ago, the Jewish News came calling. And in many ways, it's been probably the most challenging, rewarding job I've had, having a front row seat, not only to the British Jewish community, but the entire wild and occasionally wonderful world of Jewish life. It's been an extraordinary roller coaster ride. So anyway, that in a nutshell is my last 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's interesting that you characterize your time with the Jewish News like that. I mean, what makes it so wild and entertaining, and all the different adjectives that you just used?
It's an interesting community, the Jewish community. I mean, I went to Jewish primary school, secondary school, went on Israel tour. I'm a loud, proud, passionate Zionist, and I love what Israel stands for, what it's achieved, and hopefully what it will achieve in the years to come, despite its drawbacks, despite the issues that it faces, the PR battle, the problems that it has, and perhaps its lack of delicacy in terms of dealing with those issues and reflecting them to the diaspora. I do feel the diaspora gets a right kicking sometimes due to Israel and its perhaps lack of nuance and PR, but maybe we'll come on to that. So that's an interesting one, but just the endless amount of issues that we face on a weekly, daily basis at the Jewish News. I mean, issues around the diaspora are broadly similar, I'm sure. We're facing issues such as the shifting demographics between the secular and the strictly Orthodox. That's a very interesting one. In the next 30 years, the Haredi community in the UK will be bigger than the secular progressive community. And as such, there's a huge, well, not huge, I think that's unfair, but a growing intolerance, I think, between left and right, not just left and right religiosity, but left and right politically. There's organizations on the far left like Na'amod, who are anti-settlement, and organizations on the far right that are just absolutely 100% one-eyed Zionist. And getting those two to kind of fit in the same community, I think, is almost impossible. But somehow we managed to do that. We managed to fit them both on our pages. Issues that affect the world in general, like mental health and domestic abuse, online extremism, all these are issues that we juggle with and battle with all the time. The legacy of our Holocaust survivors and the memory of their legacy going through into the next generations, now that we are literally years away from saying goodbye to our final survivor. What's the responsibility of subsequent generations there? We have an issue with one of our largest soccer teams, Tottenham Hotspur, who have the fans call themselves the Y word. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word on your broadcast. It's relevant. I see you nodding, so I'll say it. They refer to themselves as the Yids, which, as we all know, is a racial slur for a Jewish person. So there's a long-held campaign on my part to try and eradicate that word from football stadiums. Spurs, Tottenham have actually acknowledged that and have backed our campaign, although they're not doing it as clearly and as loudly as I'd hope they would. But that's an issue that we're working on. Safeguarding faith schools, Shechita, Brit Milah. Youth.
I want to jump in here for a second.
Yeah, well, I was just going to keep talking for the whole hour there. I'm glad you did jump in.
Well, it's interesting. I'm a big sort of screamer of all the problems in the Jewish world, and there are a lot of problems and issues and challenges, as you've listed, locally in places like the UK and globally and regionally and internationally and so forth. At the same time, a friend of mine, Doreen Lipsky, wrote something very interesting on LinkedIn the other day. She said, listen, I mean, the news, is so focused on the negative all the time. And how do we expect people to, how do we, balance with more positive? And how do we expect people to sort of derive enjoyment and pleasure and more positive emotions from the Jewish world when we're always talking about sort of the negativity and the challenges and the problems? And so my question for you, Richard, as an editor, as somebody who's literally on the front lines of this, is how do you balance between the positive and negative in your reporting and in your discussions and dialogue about the Jewish world?
It's actually surprisingly easier than you would imagine. Now, of course, we've had some massive issues in the UK in the last couple of years when it comes to anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism in Europe is, for obvious historical reasons, not least the horrors of the last century, is a very different beast to, say, in the States. When I was in the States, the Jewish identity is loud and proud. Jews in America have the courage of their convictions. We don't have the courage of our convictions here. So we're always looking around the corner, wondering, where the next attack is coming from. God forbid you should say that I'm Jewish on a public transport. You never know who's listening. So there is that kind of paranoia. And we do need to reflect that. But it's quite straightforward when it comes to celebrating, because Jewish culture is just an extraordinary product, isn't it? I think we need a product like Judaism. And I'm not religious, as I said, I have no religious inclination whatsoever. But I love the fact that, Judaism puts at its heart, at its very epicenter, things like respect for the elderly, care in the community, the importance of charity, education, food, all these wonderful things that are just unchanged through the centuries. And I think we need those values and disciplines, particularly family values, now more than ever. So I try and imbue the Jewish news online and in print, and in the events we do a Jewish School Awards celebrating our teachers, Jewish Night of Heroes celebrating unsung heroes. We do a wedding and simcha show. So we are celebrating Hanukkah in the square. We celebrate loudly and we celebrate proudly. And the more the one thing happens, the horrors and the anti-Semitism and the prejudice, and the more the dark comes over the horizon, the more light I think we need to spread.
Absolutely. So I was reading on your Wikipedia page that, most people on their Wikipedia page, they have a short bio, some references. You have a section called controversies, which I thought was amazing.
Yeah.
And so, you wrote an article, I believe it was in 2018, called Jeremy Corbyn Cannot Be Trusted by the Jewish Community. And then it says immediately after that on your Wikipedia page that the article received much backlash and criticism. And I'm just curious because it feels to me that was a very justified and warranted article that you wrote, why you think it received so much backlash and criticism.
That was a very difficult time for the community. Back in 2015, right the way through to the end of 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn fought his second general election and led the Labour Party to its worst election defeat since 1935, we had an almighty struggle with the hard left of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn was somebody who was a backbencher, an irrelevance in Westminster for decades upon decades, and then suddenly catapulted to become leader of Her Majesty's opposition. He's always broken bread with people that the Jewish community feels very uncomfortable and unsettled with. He is a man beloved of Jew haters, somebody who's a pin-up for Holocaust deniers, for terrorist groups. Now, I'm not saying he's a Holocaust denier. He's not. I'm not saying he believes in Hamas and Hezbollah and all the other psychopathic ideologies that intent on Israel's destruction, because he doesn't. He's far more nuanced and far more intelligent than that. He's an idealist, if you like, very one-eyed, unchanging, never changes opinion. I think I wrote in that piece that a good politician is someone who's a work in progress. Jeremy Corbyn is just a piece of work, or something like that. He never changes. So what happened was he came along, and then suddenly all the anti-Zionists, all the people that are anti-NATO, anti the West, anti-America, anti the democratic Western way of life, if you like, anarchists, rabble rousers, they all rallied behind him, thinking, okay, the lunatic's taken over the asylum here. And then suddenly Labour members were allowed to tweet about Zionism being Nazism, and then the next day stand as Labour councillors. There were reports about incriminating files about anti-Semitism suddenly vanishing from Labour headquarters and no questions asked. There was a whole Megillah about IHRA, the International Holocaust Standard Definition of anti-Semitism, adopted by countries worldwide, that Jeremy Corbyn, still doesn't acknowledge. It got to the point where my paper, the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Telegraph in Manchester, took the position that we needed to speak as one, and we all published the same front page editorial. I don't think that had ever happened before, definitely not in the UK newspaper industry, maybe not even worldwide. That got a lot of attention, and we did a lot of media around that. Luckily, we didn't have to worry, because the great British voter could see through the man and what he stood for, and sent him packing in December 2019. As I said, he led his party to the worst defeat since before the war. We now have a leader called Keir Starmer in the Labour Party, who's trying to clean out the closet, but it's hard work for him. Even today on the website, we've published a report that says 80% of disciplinary cases dealt with by the Labour Party currently are anti-Semitic issues. So clearly there's still a lot to do. But Corbyn's been kicked out of the Labour Party. He now stands as an independent, and politics is looking a lot more sane than it was a few years ago. Unfortunately, our government is a shambles. Boris Johnson and the Tory government is hardly covering itself in glory. There's been no end of issues that it's had to face. And with a serious opposition in place, there's no way he'd still be prime minister. But he's taken advantage of the fact that there's no real opposition. But politics is not such a scary place for the Jewish community as perhaps it was only a few years ago.
Interesting. So, one of the things that when we talk about the Jewish diaspora, we talk a lot about the American Jewish population, because it's a massive population, second biggest Jewish population in the world. But I feel that the UK Jewish population is also, well, not as massive in numbers, certainly has the respect and the fortitude that maybe it doesn't get as much credit for, at least compared to the Americans. I'm just curious, from your eyes, what are some of the things that you would say are similarities between sort of UK Jews and the rest of diaspora Jews? And what are some maybe special or unique things about the UK Jewish community?
Well, I touched upon, I think, the lack of the courage of our convictions that we have here in the UK. When I was in the States, as I mentioned in my intro, I was editor of the Boston Jewish Advocate, and I absolutely delighted in the fact that Jewish culture was part of American culture, it was a part of Americana. And you can see it in the food, the restaurants, the TV, the comedy. It's imbued with Yiddishkeit in a way that you just don't have here in the UK. In the UK, I think we're kind of catching up a little bit. There are things in the Jewish community here over the last, certainly during my tenure, the last 12 or 13 years, that have appeared that I think do imbue those American Jewish values. There's a Jewish community centre that's opened in the centre of London called JW3, which is very loud and proud. We have a Hanukkah in the Square, which is a big celebration in Trafalgar Square. We have Limud, which is a celebration of Jewish culture that takes place around Christmas, Hanukkah time. So we are getting there. But it's very difficult here in Britain, I think, because we're such a small community. There's only 270,000 out of more than 60 million people. And most of us live within sort of 20 square miles of where I'm talking to you in the borough of Barnet in northwest London. There's little patches in Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Glasgow, but in the main, we are a small community. The problem for me is on the European continent, where there are countries, particularly France, where there are immigrant Muslim communities that are violently opposed to having a Jew in their midst. There are parts of Paris that are particularly terrifying. And the amount of aliyah, the amount of movement of French Jewry to Israel has been absolutely staggering. It's worth noting that the movement of Jews from the UK during the Corbyn era to Israel was a little bit higher, but I think there was a pragmatism there that things would get better and that the British public would see through someone like Corbyn and not wish to have his militant Marxist agenda ruling the roost. Corbyn's shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer waved Chairman Mao's little red book in the House of Commons, which gives you an idea of their mindset. So while I think things are difficult here, they are improving. We don't have the power of our numbers that I think American Jews enjoy, but it's a lot better here than it is in parts of Europe, particularly in France.
So you mentioned Jewish culture, which I just wrote an essay called "What Should Judaism Sell?" And basically the preface was that, by and large, you mentioned I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious, because a lot of people today think Judaism is a religion, and that's fine. We know why that is, more recently in the last few hundred years with sort of Western civilization and how they treat religions and things of that nature. But I wrote in this essay that Judaism should stop selling religion. In fact, I even say we should stop using that word altogether when talking about Judaism, and we should instead sell, quote unquote, sell Jewish wisdom and Jewish culture. And you mentioned Jewish culture and how you enjoyed how it's so imbued in sort of greater American culture. But as I was writing this essay, I understood that there's no real definition of Jewish culture. I mean, you have, I think, two sides to the Jewish culture coin, right? You have the sort of what we can call general non-Israeli Jewish culture, which is mainly driven, as you said, by US Jews, because they represent the world's second biggest Jewish population after Israel. And because so many Jews work in Hollywood and sort of its affiliates, Jewish culture is sort of in some ways part of that US pop culture. But then you have Israeli Jewish culture, which is incredibly different from what I just described. And that's really a combination of European countries, the Ashkenazi Jews, and Middle Eastern people, Jews, of course, Mizrahi and Sephardic, And so they brought their cultures with them as they moved to Israel. But then in the last, whatever, 25 to 30 years of people that were now born in Israel, Jews born in Israel, not the ones that immigrated, they've created a unique Israeli culture based on their lived experiences being born and raised in Israel. And so I feel that actually it's creating, this double-sided coin that I just portrayed. I feel it's creating issues because you have sort of US driven Jewish culture, and then you have Israeli culture. And in many ways, they're very different. And in many ways, Israeli Jews don't understand sort of the general worldwide Jewish culture, if you will. And the diaspora Jews, some of them, like yourself, do understand Israeli culture because you work in the industry, but many of them do not. I'm just curious, when I paint this picture, what goes through your mind?
I wouldn't dare to suggest that I understand Israeli culture. I mean, I've been to Israel 30, 40, 50 times over the last 30, 40 years. Every time I go there, I arrive, my heart filled with happiness and joy and respect and admiration in the main. And I leave thinking, what sort of country is this? It is like landing on the moon sometimes, just in terms of, I think, the culture and the issues and the challenges that they face on a daily basis. I mean, particularly the fact that Scotland, Ireland, and Wales don't want to invade England on a 24-hour basis, which that permanent issue of state security is one I think imbues Israeli culture in a way that I'll never really understand, but will always respect. Yeah, it's interesting. Everything starts, I think, since 1948. I think Jewish identity does have Israel at its epicenter in a way that it perhaps didn't beforehand. And I think youth disengagement from Israel has certainly shaped new Jewish identities, new Jewish cultures and communities. I mean, when I were a lad back in the late 80s, I went on FZY Israel tour 1987, and I came back, a good Zionist. I appreciated it was a small country punching above its weight, the issues it had to face. And back then, I think there was more goodwill towards Israel by people maybe uninitiated by the politics of the Middle East. Now that disengagement is quite stark. It's definitely among 20 and 30 somethings, and it has changed the diaspora's relationship with the Jewish state. I mentioned organizations like Na'amod, and there's Bet Selem and other organizations. And it's not a given that when Israel hits the news that the Jewish community here in the UK is, to a man and a woman, going to speak up and stand up for Israel and what it faces. The death of the Al Jazeera journalist a few weeks ago, I think, is a very good case in point. Me personally, and a lot of members of my staff and secular members of the community, are very keen for Israel to be transparent. And I know they have tried to be transparent, and a lot of that death has been used as propaganda and has been misplaced and manipulated. But we want to see Israel do the right thing, say the right thing, even when it reflects poorly on it. Whereas sometimes I think people have a knee-jerk reaction that Israel can do no wrong. So when that happens, I think the support for Israel is there, but it's certainly not as relied upon as it once was.
Do you find also that this sort of youth engagement in the UK is as pervasive as it is, for example, in the States?
It was interesting, actually, because when Jeremy Corbyn came along, the youth engagement amongst young people for Jeremy was extraordinary, especially amongst university campuses. There was the famous chant, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," to the tune of the White Stripes anthem that was ringing around campuses for a number of years. So I think, young people are perhaps a bit more inclined to be a bit more radical, a bit more skeptical, and a bit more sort of questioning of Israel. And also shul membership here in the UK, it's still predominantly families, people in their 30s, 40s and above. People don't really engage in Jewish life in Jewish society until they have kids of their own. And then I think it becomes important. But that window between, say, 15 and 30, I think is becoming a lot more radical, a lot more political. And as I said, I don't think Israel can take that group for granted.
I'm trying to understand. I read an article recently about a rise in Aliyah. A lot of it was because of the pandemic, in that people now can work remotely. It's more, acceptable, so to speak. Do you feel that sort of, you mentioned this, would you say 80% of cases that are being heard or overseen by the labor's NEC? So do you feel that you're seeing more of an interest in Aliyah from UK Jews now and from sort of your UK neighbors, or do you feel that ultimately Jews are still happy to be living where they are today?
The people I know that have made Aliyah, I think had made that decision a long time ago and always wanted to do it for whatever reason, whether it was psychological or familial or religious. It's not something you just suddenly decide one day to pack your bags and head off to Heathrow Airport. I think people have decided that that's something they want to do at a time of their lives, and then they go ahead and do it. I think it's a lot more predictable and a lot more routine rather than just fleeing. I mean, we don't tend to flee. And the Jewish community in this country is very, very well embedded, very diverse. I've written in the past that Jews don't define themselves by anti-Semitism. They define themselves by the contribution they make to life here in Britain. And that really is how I underpin everything that I try and do at the Jewish News, the contribution we make. And we do make an enormous contribution in all sorts of different spheres. And that, for me, is Jewish life, British Jewish life, Anglo-British Jewish identity. And it's a lot different to the Israeli Jewish identity. About 7 or 8 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu made an appeal to diaspora Jewry and said, come to Israel. And I wrote a piece saying that Israel's not my home. I always understand a need for it, a sanctuary, if you will, based on the history of the last 80 or 90 years. But I'm no more Israeli as I am Portuguese. I have my own identity. I was born in London, raised in London, and I contribute to London's Jewish community. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's a strange balance, isn't it, for a lot of people to understand. As I said, I go to Israel. I feel at home, but it's not my home.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. I think what's interesting though is what I would like to see, something that I've actually even thought about maybe starting myself, is how do we create more fluidity between Jewish communities in Israel? So, it's not just coming to Israel for sort of a vacation, but maybe it's a short-term stay, but it's done in a way that can be what I would call plug and play. Meaning, if Richard could come to Israel for 3 months out of the year, for example, or 2 months out of the year, or whatever it shakes out, and when he gets here, he has, a comfortable landing. He has a nice, desirable place to stay. He has sort of an easy way to work from Israel, if he chooses to work and not just vacation. And also built-in social opportunities, because that's an important part of, being in a place, obviously, for an extended period of time. And I'm just curious, like, that to me feels like a very nice middle ground for Jews around the world, not just from the UK, because as you said yourself, there's a clear disconnect between a lot of Jews today in Israel, just from an understanding standpoint. It's not about do I support, do I not support, do I like, do I not like. It's just, do I feel a part? Do I understand the culture? Do I understand the language? Do I understand the history and the society? And I think when you develop a deeper understanding, which I ultimately believe, the best way to do it is to be here. You can do it through movies and TV shows like Izzy, and you can do it in other forms and fashions, but ultimately to be here, I think you absorb it so much more and it resonates so much more. To me, that's something that I would like to see a lot more, as opposed to just, either sending young Jews on birthright for 10 days or people coming to Israel a few times a year on vacation, but still sort of being an outsider. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I should probably ask you that question as someone who came from the West Coast of the United States and has now made a successful life for themselves in Israel, you would know better than I. We did an interesting project, the Aliyah 100 list a few years ago, when we celebrated 100 people born in Britain who then moved to Israel, and did what you just said, affected, influenced for the better Israeli life. Some extraordinary people. We had a wonderful reception at the UK ambassador's residence just outside Tel Aviv, and it was a real celebration of how British Jews have done exactly what you just said. I mean, of course, I would love to. I'll put my swimming trunks on, do a lovely day's work in the morning, and then head off to the beach, do a bit of volleyball on Tel Aviv beach in the afternoon. That'd be wonderful. I think the practicalities of it, unfortunately, are slightly different. And I don't know, again, maybe something you need to maybe answer yourself, or ask the diaspora minister if he's willing to subsidize something like that, because yes, I'd certainly be first in line.
So let's go back to, UK Jews. It's one thing to have people coming to Israel, but tell us a little bit about, if I'm a Jew, or if I'm a non-Jew, but I'm interested in Jewish culture, Jewish people, etc., and I come to the UK, what are some of the things that you recommend I do, within the first week, let's say?
Wow. So you come off the plane, and then you'll probably get picked up at Heathrow Airport by a Jewish black cab driver, a taxi driver, who will tell you all about the Jewish life in the Old East End and Brick Lane, and he'll drive you to the Jewish bagel bakery in Brick Lane, where you can get a fabulous bagel with a giant swad of salt beef. What do you call salt beef in the States? Not sure.
Cream cheese?
No, it's meat. Is it corned beef?
Pastrami? Is it pastrami?
Yeah, like a big old chunk of pastrami. Then he'd drive you to the JW3 Centre on the Finchley Road, where you could do, some Krav Maga, or bake a challah, and eat a lovely milk meal in their fabulous restaurant. You could go to the Jewish Museum in Camden, which has got an amazing Amy Winehouse exhibition, which is absolutely fascinating. So there's so much that you could do. It's as I said, it's an extraordinary, diverse, and interesting community that has changed out of all proportion, even in the last 10 years.
The royal family obviously gets a lot of attention coming out of the UK, and I just read an article on the Jewish News that I believe Kate was rekindled with a Holocaust survivor. I'm just curious, from your vantage point, what's the relationship between the UK Jewish community and the Royal Palace?
I just put that article up half an hour before we started talking, so I'm very glad you gave me a hit for that one. The Duchess of Cambridge has been phenomenal for the Jewish community. She's a keen photographer. She took some photographs of Holocaust survivors for us last year. For the for Holocaust Memorial Day, which was a wonderful treat, and the website has just gone up for that photo gallery of survivors, which was very, very moving. It was a photo tribute to them. Prince Charles has long been a very passionate advocate of Holocaust memorial and commemoration. And yes, as the Queen celebrates her platinum jubilee, 70 years on the throne, at the moment, it's a good time to sort of reflect on how the royal family and the Jewish community have been kind of interlinked over the years. But I think particularly on issues such as Holocaust commemoration, both Kate and William, I think, have been very, very proactive, and a cause of great pride and comfort for the community here.
Richard, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you doing this.
Is that it? Is it over already?
That's it.
Gosh, time flies. Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure.